Good morning, everybody. I'm Dan Newhouse, Chairman of the Congressional Western Caucus, and I want to welcome all of our witnesses, our members that are with us, and those that are yet to come, and certainly our guests that are in attendance at today's Endangered Species Act Working Group Forum. As you probably know, the purpose of the forum is to hear from witnesses from across the country. So we've assembled in a group of people with that criteria. We want to hear about their experiences with the ESA and their ideas to reform it. I do want to be clear, this event is not an official hearing or meeting of the House Committee on Natural Resources. Documents produced to support this forum may not necessarily reflect the views of the committee or its members. However, to preserve order and decorum during this forum, we will adhere to the spirit of the rules of committee. I will start with 5 minutes of an opening statement and then turn it over to my co-chair, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Westerman, for his opening statement, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists for your statements, after which time has expired. We'll turn our working group members turn to them to offer statements as well as questions for our panelists. So now I'd like to recognize myself for my opening statement. First of all, let me say I'm delighted to see everyone gathered here today to discuss what I would say is a very, very important topic. To hear from stakeholders from across the country on how the ESA affects them, who you folks are on the ground, and along with their ideas, like I said, on how to reform this law. Now, the ESA, and some people would say, is outdated and needs reforming. And I would say while its initial reasons for being instated were noble, its implementation has been somewhat mixed. It's been weaponized by environmental groups to reduce or eliminate ranching as well as renewable resource development. It's confusing conservation with preservation. The ESA must not only prevent extinctions, but must also provide incentives for landowners to support species facing declining populations. That's key. After 50 years of being the law of the land, it's long past time for meaningful reform of the ESA. The members have joined this working group and seek to examine how the ESA is being implemented by federal agencies, how litigation is driving ESA decision-making, and how success is defined under the ESA. Today we will hear from a panel of stakeholders representing farmers, ranchers, offshore energy, sportsmen, small businesses, local governments, to highlight how the ESA can better help recover species while also reducing the regulatory burdens placed on our partners on the ground. I want to use this forum to highlight an ongoing effort by the Fish and Wildlife Service to utilize Section 10J of the ESA to reintroduce, or I should say introduce, grizzly bears to the North Cascades ecosystem. The debate over grizzly bear introduction in my state of Washington really is nothing new. In 1995, Washington state lawmakers mandated by law that grizzly bears shall not be transplanted or introduced into the state. That's state law. Since then, the federal government has made multiple attempts to bypass our state's law and illegally introduce this apex predator into the North Cascades ecosystem. Our public lands, including the North Cascades National Park, are critical to our region for species conservation, enjoyment, and recreation, and for our water supply, as well as our important agricultural industry. The introduction of grizzly bears would upset our ecosystem and cause undue hardships on the farmers and ranchers in a rather, I would say, remote part of my district. This is the message that I've heard and that I've echoed time and time again, listening to the people from the rural communities across our district. In fact, I'm proud to have worked with officials from the last two administrations to convey this exact message. In 2020, after hundreds, literally hundreds of residents spoke out against this proposal, the Department of Interior came to the conclusion that the introduction of grizzly was not necessary for species recovery and that the proposal would not be pursued any further. Unfortunately, there's been a change in administration and they have changed their minds. Last November, the Biden administration began the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement process, to evaluate options and to solicit comments for introducing grizzlies into the North Cascades. We were expecting to see the draft EIS and a proposed 10J rule this summer, accompanied by a public comment period and 3 forums open to the public. But as you probably know, my constituents are still in the dark on what the status of the process is. The northern part of my district, we have winter. Sometimes during the winter, it's very difficult to travel. And a delayed EIS process means that opportunities for ranchers, for residents to voice their displeasure would be limited or would have to be virtual rather than be face-to-face. While we wait for Fish and Wildlife to produce a draft EIS on the proposed 10J rule, the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriations passed out of committee a bill with language that would prevent funds from being used to relocate grizzlies to the North Cascades. This issue remains one of my top priorities in Congress, and I'm proud to be a part of the working group here to continue to highlight this issue and work towards reform. With that, I will now recognize my co-chair on this working group, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Westerman from Arkansas, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Newhouse, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And Dan, I just have to again thank you for your leadership on this issue and for the Western Caucus stepping into it and not coming at this from the standpoint that the Endangered Species Act is not something that I think most Americans support, but it's something that was set in place with well-meaning that I don't think has achieved the goals that we would hope that it would achieve. And I can tell you my goal is not to do away with the ESA, but to make the ESA something that works, that is beneficial for not just endangered species, but all species. And I've said all along that instead of focusing on species, what we have to focus on is habitat. If you get the correct habitat, you're doing the most that you can do to help a species. And there are times when we obviously have to take extra precautions to help some species, but the ESA needs to be about protecting endangered species and not about pushing any kind of political issues or using it in a way that's not focused on helping endangered species. And with that being said, just because the ESA is broken, I don't think is reason we should jettison it. I think we should fix it. And I think the goal of this task force is to figure out how to fix the ESA. And we know that no law, no matter how well-intentioned, should be used as a political battering ram. And it shouldn't be used to benefit certain groups. This law should be focused on benefiting endangered species and all species and being the good stewards of our habitat that we should be. The members of this working group are made up of members of the House Natural Resources Committee and the Congressional Western Caucus, and we're hearing from a diverse set of witnesses who will discuss their experiences with the ESA and ideas to modernize and reform the Act. So far this Congress, the Committee on Natural Resources has held 2 legislative hearings on ESA legislation, resulting in the markup of 6 bills. In July, 2 of those bills were passed by the full House of Representatives. In addition, the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries has held hearings examining the cost of the ESA. As long as I am chairman, the House Committee on Natural Resources will continue to make oversight of the ESA and regulatory overreaches an important part of the committee work. I want to thank again Dan for the work that he's done as chairman of the Western Caucus. And I want to thank all the members of the working group for their willingness to participate and devote time to addressing this important issue. This is an issue when you say you're going to try to fix the Endangered Species Act, you oftentimes get attacked and people make things up about what you're trying to do. But that's when it takes courage to go forward and have these hearings and to come up with what real solutions are that, again, are focused on the goal of the ESA. And the goal of this group is simple. It's to craft policy proposals that reform the ESA to the point that it reaches its original goal of recovering at-risk species so they no longer need the protection outlined under the Act, meaning that they have recovered. That's always been the purported goal of the ESA, and we want to return the law to its original intent. This December, as you all know, marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the ESA, and unfortunately, the recovery rate for animals is a dismal 3% of the listed species that have ever been, only 3% have ever been delisted. There are many reasons for the failure, but there's no excuses for the failure. And our job is to figure out why it's failing and to come up with the solutions that not only make the ESA work for endangered species, but also make it work for our economy. And I fully believe that we can have a strong economy and a healthy environment at the same time. Some people want to say those two are mutually exclusive. I think they're dependent on each other. And when we have a strong economy and when we're focused on the real goals of laws like the ESA, we're going to have a healthy environment to go along with it. Over the next few months, this working group will utilize the work previously undertaken by the committee and the Western Caucus and our working group to move forward to craft policy proposals that better the ESA both for species and our constituents. Today is the first step in that endeavor, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. I say that knowing that we've got a committee meeting going on down the hall, and I'm going to be jumping back and forth, but I look forward to not only hearing from you, but reading your testimony and working with you as we move forward. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. So before we begin, I'm going to clear my throat and exercise a chairman's prerogative. We just learned of news this morning that a colleague of ours from Alaska, Mary Peltola's husband, was killed in a plane accident just this morning. And she's headed back to Alaska, as you can imagine, to be with her family. So I would just like to ask, if, as a member of the Western Caucus, that we remember our colleague and pause for a moment of silent prayer, if you would. Thank you very much. So, before I introduce our invited witnesses, I just want to remind them that they should limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. Your complete written statement will be submitted to the record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone in front of you. We do use timing lights, and you're familiar with the colors, green, yellow, and red. You know what that means. When you have 1 minute remaining, it's going to turn yellow, and then at the end of the 5 minutes, it will be red. I'll ask you to please then complete your statement. And I should note that I will allow all witnesses to testify before we turn to the members for their statements and questioning. So with that, I now recognize Mr. Ryan Bronson. He's Director of Government Affairs for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Mr. Bronson, you may begin. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Newhouse, Chairman Westerman, and members of the working group. I'm Ryan Bronson, Director of Government Affairs for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. The Elk Foundation is a 225,000-member nonprofit conservation organization with a mission to ensure the future of elk, other wildlife, their habitat, and our hunting heritage. We're headquartered in Missoula, Montana. Since our founding in 1984, we've helped conserve and enhance more than 8.6 million acres and improved access to 1.5 million acres. Our 500 chapters raise money in communities across the country to help us accomplish this mission. Since we're talking about the Endangered Species Act today, I will focus more on the other wildlife part of our mission. But I do think it's worth noting that elk and many game species in America have a history of endangerment and extinction as well, and their modern abundance should be a signal to us that recovery and prosperity is achievable. In the early 20th century, the continental elk population had declined to as low as 50,000 head, less than 1% of their population prior to European settlement. Two subspecies of elk, the eastern and the Merriam, are extinct. Had the Endangered Species Act existed at the time, elk would have most certainly been candidates for listing. However, elk and other wildlife benefited from an emerging conservation movement in this country and the birth of the North American model, where professional biologists regulated harvest, private and public land managers restored habitat, and hunters helped to fund the endeavor through license fees and the Pittman-Robertson excise taxes on firearms. Today, Colorado alone has 280,000 elk. The Elk Foundation supports efforts to recover endangered and threatened wildlife in their critical habitats. Our concerns are mostly focused on how the ESA has been manipulated to prevent management of large swaths of our public lands by litigious special interests, and how difficult it has been to get recovered species off of the list and fully into the authority of state wildlife agencies. The Elk Foundation's top federal policy priority is fixing the 2015 Cottonwood Environmental Law Center versus U.S. Forest Service decision from the Ninth Circuit Court. This interpretation by the court requires federal land agencies to reconsult every time with the Fish and Wildlife Service whenever new information about a listed species or their habitat becomes available. This creates an endless review loop that has led to hundreds of projects being delayed, and in several cases, those delays have led to catastrophic habitat loss due to wildfire. H.R. 200, authored by Representative Rosendale, passed the House Natural Resources Committee earlier this year, and it addresses the problems while keeping the underlying requirement for endangered species consultation intact, and we support it. Closely related to the Cottonwood decision is the issue of serial litigation. 2 years ago, the Elk Foundation published in our Bugle magazine an article entitled Equal Access to Injustice. In it, we laid out the case that the Equal Access to Justice Act has been co-opted by large and well-funded nonprofit organizations who are able to be reimbursed by the federal agencies they sue over and over again because they are exempt from the means test applied to individuals and corporations. This creates perverse incentives. As grizzly bears and gray wolves have ping-ponged back and forth onto and off of the list, environmental organizations have repeatedly collected attorney's fees, costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Finally, we're concerned that the manipulation of the Endangered Species Act is undermining state sovereignty with regards to wildlife management. Individual states manage hundreds of species of wildlife that are not endangered or threatened, and modern state wildlife agencies are professional and scientific organizations. While I recognize that some interest groups would prefer that wildlife management only consist of protection and preservation, the primary aspects of the Endangered Species Act, 100 years of holistic wildlife management has demonstrated that actively managing habitats and scientifically regulated harvest are parts of long-term sustainability. The Endangered Species Act should not be used to keep states from managing their wildlife just because special interests don't like the specific nuances in the way that a state does it. That seems to be the motivation for keeping wolves in the Great Lakes and grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem listed. The states have worked to meet the 5 factors of the Endangered Species Act delisting, and management should return to the states. I want to thank you for exploring this complicated wildlife management issue, and I look forward to working with Congress to improve wildlife management for all species.
Thank you, Mr. Bronson. Just perfect. Now I want to recognize Mr. Rick Grinnell, co-founder of the Southern Arizona Business Coalition, for 5 minutes. Mr. Grinnell.
Good morning, Chairmen, honorable members. Just one quick comment. First of all, you gave an Irishman a microphone, and then you tell him he only got 5 minutes. And so with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today regarding the Endangered Species Act. I speak with you on behalf of my co-founder, Bill Austenmacher, a gentleman of over 50 years in the mining and engineering business, and as well as our 25 supporting member organizations and over 600 personalities that sign on to our regular email updates. We advocate on behalf of the mining industry. This industry is essential for our modern lifestyle in every aspect. We are a significant contributor to the economy, and I consider myself a student of this remarkable industry and the benefits it provides our society. Our industry has evolved into one of the most passionate and environmental partners in society. Our member organizations often find themselves working closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and voluntary conservation efforts, and routinely engage with the service and compliance matters related to the Endangered Species Act. We value the fundamental purposes of the Act and larger goals espoused by intentional conversations to foster biological diversity. We look forward to make our efforts a win-win opportunities and continue to promote these efforts each day. We realize the Act represents an important commitment to the federal government in biodiversity and species conservation, and some would argue in a moral commitment, and yet has devolved into one of the most litigated pieces of environmental legislation ever promulgated. The ESA is being used by opponents of the important resource development projects to slow down and ultimately stop these projects. To meet the important goals of the Act and continue to meet the economic needs of this great country, a much more collaborative effort is needed to move the goals forward. The Endangered Species Reform Act, NESARC, is a leading group trying to do just that. I've included a summary of their efforts in a partial submittal. With respect to the topics today, such things come top of mind, and given the short clock here, I will touch on a couple of things that are most immediate to Southern Arizona. The jaguar. The jaguar is transitioned across Mexico, South America, and into the southern parts of Arizona for hundreds of years, and yet we had to fight vigorously to find a way to remove part of the acreage from, and it was recently passed by the Supreme Court. We need to adequately fund and staff and train the United States Forest Service to handle the workloads they are currently experiencing. Reducing these workloads by passing legislation to modify citizen suit provisions, and also find a way for these sue and settle issues to come to an actual stop. Taxpayers are absorbing these costs. The ESA should be updated to refine the conservation of species to make it clear that critical habitats is designated to include only those that are indispensable for species conservation and not something that can be used as a federal regulation tool. As we get close to the end here, you have the written document in front of it, but on a personal, our industry employs over 10,000 people directly or indirectly just in Southern Arizona alone. The economic impact is over $1 billion just to Southern Arizona, over $5 billion statewide. We have over 50,000 people's lives being affected directly and indirectly because of our mining industry. Our industry provides the critical resources that I understand my friend Congressman Gosar is down the hall here listening to, which provides let me put it this way. We want to have green energy. We want to have all these tools, but we don't want to have mining by certain people. You can't have one without the other. And with that, I say thank you again for your time, and I appreciate your efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Grinnell, and good job being an Irishman and having to live by a clock. I'd like to now turn to a friend of mine, County Commissioner from my home county of Yakima, Chair of the Board of the Yakima County Commissioners, as well as a member of the Washington Association of Counties Board, Ms. Amanda McKinney. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Congressman Newhouse. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and honorable members of this Western Caucus Forum. My name is Amanda McKinney, Yakima County Commissioner, and it is a privilege to be here today in our nation's capital to offer remarks on behalf of Yakima County, Washington, the heart of Washington State and the premier agriculturally producing county in the Pacific Northwest. We proudly grow your beer, your wine, and of course our world-famous Washington apples. I come to you today as a proud daughter of rural America, raised in and by an ag community. Small town Friday nights, your teacher is your coach, is your youth group leader, where everyone pitches in for harvest and everyone knows who your parents are. I have the distinct honor of serving my community as county commissioner, where small town values give us divine purpose and immense joy every day. I am a product of the 70s. I was allowed to stay out after dark, climb tall trees, float irrigation canals, ski and ride a bike without a helmet, drive heavy farm machinery as a teenager, ride shotgun in my dad's Willie at 10, and even drink water out of a garden hose. I listened to country music, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and Guns N' Roses. Those were great times to be a kid. I knew my country cared for and respected our farmers and ranchers who fed the nation and kept the American spirit of self-reliance, resilience, and discovery alive. We were humble, grateful, and cared deeply for the land that gave us so much. Times have certainly changed. I have 2 children. I can track their whereabouts in real time on an app. They text me midday asking for their PE shoes that they left on the floor despite my many warnings to put it in your backpack. They have different helmets for every sport. Their window to the world is one Wi-Fi password away. They are exactly who you think to ask when you cannot figure out where to say, click here, and they find it. They are exposed to more information and news in one day than I was in 1 month or more. What they are seeing and hearing is not inspiring or uplifting. It's confusing. It makes the people they care about visibly angry and upset. And they hear adults in rooms constantly saying, this doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't. Which brings us to why we're here today, to discuss another product of the 70s. The Endangered Species Act endeavored to memorialize our role as stewards of the land and provide a guiding compass to direct our energy and resources for the protection and preservation of our natural environment and native species so they would thrive. It inspired children like me to conserve, recycle, and be aware of my impact on the world around me. I teach my children how to live in harmony with nature today. Though well-intentioned, this act is stuck in the past, and it gains more opposition than measurable success as each decade passes away without modernization. The need for greater harmony within the act is clear. This body will hear from many incredibly articulate and well-studied individuals representing a broad spectrum of American interests: farmers, ranchers, hunters, conservationists, and perhaps a few lay people like me, a local elected who's here to manage the precious little revenue we have to maintain our dirt roads, keep noxious weeds down, and make sure a sheriff's deputy is there when you have an emergency. We are here to translate conflicting and contradicting state and federal laws for our businesses and our property owners. In the fertile Yakima Valley Basin, we are limited by the realities of both nature and regulation and how we protect our most precious resource, water. As much of the West is experiencing, a water shortage is a sure way to spend a lot of time and even more money to eventually prove that everyone doesn't have enough. Since time immemorial, we have also experienced epic numbers of native fish species in the Basin. Naturally occurring weather pattern shifts and human activity have modified the landscape. Our local community and nation tribes are dedicated to restoring these native fish populations. Despite the harsh reality that there is not enough water to go around, we work together in the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan to pursue efforts to increase water for irrigation, municipal, domestic use, and in-stream fish supplies. Our biggest issue is that through hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent in the Yakima Basin to achieve all of these goals, we are under duress from the federal government and the ESA to say that we have simply not succeeded enough. I will leave you with that in the short 3 years as commissioner, I have seen faces light up when a solution is brought forward, but conversations are derailed and deflated because the positive impact won't add up to enough. I thank you for your dedication to service above self and for your commitment to amending and modernizing this act, and it's been an immense privilege to be here with you today.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. I now recognize Mr. Ken Hamilton, who's the Executive Vice President of the Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, for 5 minutes. Mr. Hamilton.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee and the Western Caucus. I'm Ken Hamilton. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. I've been with the Farm Bureau for 39 years. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you about the Endangered Species Act, how it affects my members, and some suggestions that
Mr.
would-
Hamilton,
Is your microphone
is your
on, sir?
microphone on?
It was. Sorry. Is that a little better?
There you go.
Sorry.
Yeah, get it right up close.
Okay, I apologize. Anyway, and some ideas on how to make the law work better. As a result of the climate and topography in Wyoming, livestock, mainly cattle, is the largest commodity raised by our members. Many of our members are 4th or 5th generation ranchers or farmers. My parents were the 3rd generation, and my nephew is the 5th generation to work on our family ranch. I've worked on a number of issues surrounding endangered species, including large predators listed as endangered, namely wolves and grizzly bears. It's a significant challenge to have protected predator species introduced or moving into an area with livestock. Cattle and sheep are both on the list of food items for wolves and grizzly bears, and consequently, we were heavily involved in the federal government's effort to introduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park as an experimental non-essential population. We were actively involved in the process for introduction because our members had multiple concerns. While the greater Yellowstone area was identified as the primary area for wolves, no one seriously thought wolves would be content to remain in the area. This is exactly what occurred with my brother when a wolf attacked his sheep herd in July of 2010. That attack killed 18 lambs and 1 ewe, and then 6 nights later, the wolf returned and killed 5 more lambs. The Fish and Wildlife Service employee who investigated the incident felt it was the work of one wolf. It should be noted that none of the killed lambs or the ewe were eaten. For a time, Defenders of Wildlife provided compensation for wolf depredation, and now the Wyoming Game and Fish Department provides some compensation. But the actions of the federal government make it clear that impacts caused by species on the Endangered Species Act are not considered. Another concern for our members is that delisting will not occur once recovery levels are reached. The initial recovery goal of 10 breeding pairs in 3 states was changed several times by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the service decided that 100 wolves in Yellowstone should not count towards Wyoming's population. Then they decided that another 50 wolves or 5 breeding pairs should be allowed. Moving the goalposts is not uncommon when dealing with the federal government. It has created distrust between Wyoming citizens and the service. Wyoming officials continued to negotiate with the Fish and Wildlife Service and eventually reached an agreement that resulted in a proposal for wolves to be delisted in Wyoming. Of course, to no one's surprise, the decision was immediately challenged in the courts, which is another concern for our members. It would be helpful if judicial review and some of the decisions could be limited. Congress also needs to place state wildlife agencies on a more even footing with the Fish and Wildlife Service so that the process is more of a partnership with the state. There is considerably more interaction with game and fish personnel and most ranchers develop a working relationship with them. Finally, Fish and Wildlife Service needs to seek partnerships with landowners so that having a potential endangered or threatened species in the area is not something landowners resent or fear. Wyoming has been working with many affected interests to support the greater sage grouse, and our members have joined the CCAAs for sage grouse, but a listing that impacts both private and public lands can potentially reduce or eliminate the federal lands grazing necessary for ranchers to survive as an economic unit. So in conclusion, changes that will make recovery work better are: when a listing will create an economic hardship for landowners, the federal government should step up with the financial help. If incentives and more substantial guarantees are provided to landowners who have species on their land, they would be more likely to share that information with Fish and Wildlife. The federal government needs to live up to their agreements, stop saying one thing and doing another, and use some mechanism to prevent the goalposts from being moved by both the administrative agency and the judicial branch. The federal government needs to work with states as equal partners, and the federal government should acknowledge the importance of private landowners and work to develop trust with those entities. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions my comments may have raised.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. I now recognize Mr. Kevin Bruce, who is Vice President of Government Affairs at Arena Offshore, for 5 minutes. Mr. Bruce.
Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. In addition to representing Arena Offshore, I'm also the executive director of a group called the Gulf Energy Alliance, which is a coalition of independent producers, all of which are small businesses, and almost all of our operations are exclusively focused in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. So I'm here this morning to talk about endangered species regulation through litigation. But before I jump into the details on that, I want to talk a little bit about what's at stake here. You go on to the next one. So, and I want to start by talking about just global oil historical demand and where it's headed. Our own government projects that by 2030, there's going to be an annual demand forecast is 109 million barrels a day. If you look back at 2020, when the entire world was shut down, demand only fell to 92 million barrels a day. That tells you that demand is going to remain, for the foreseeable future, a very stubborn thing. Go on to the next one. And you look at global population trends. By the end of this year, we'll have 8 billion people on this planet. The average American consumes about 22 barrels per person on an annual basis. As India, and particularly the countries on the African continent, continue to develop, that's only going to increase. So the question becomes, where should we get that oil? The world's going to need it. Where should it come from? The U.S. Gulf of Mexico is among the cleanest on the planet when it comes to emissions. You know, the states where we operate also are supportive of what we do. We employ hundreds of thousands of people in largely rural communities all across the Gulf South with very vast supply chains. And yet, what do we get? This was a quote from just over a month ago from President Biden in a Weather Channel interview. I wanted to stop all the drilling on the on the East Coast and the West Coast and in the Gulf, but I lost in court. But we're still pushing really very hard. Every regulation that we see coming out of the government has to be seen through this lens. Believe them when they tell you what their intent is when it comes to the Gulf of Mexico. And meanwhile, production in Iran and Venezuela is up over 20% since Biden's inauguration. And so the Rice as Well issue, this is a classic case of sue and settle. Anti-fossil fuel activists, including the Sierra Club, the Center for Biological Diversity, and Friends of the Earth, sued the administration, and the administration basically agreed to all of their demands and forced a settlement down the throat of the industry without any meaningful opportunity to participate in a notice and comment procedure. There's currently an ongoing ESA process to determine if an expanded protected area is scientifically warranted and not just a wish list from these groups. And this is all about the Rice as Well, which is a species that was designated back in 2021. And the expansion as a result of the settlement is basically entirely based on the possible observation of a single Rice as Well in the western Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Texas 7 years ago. So if you look, and there's a lot in here, but I'm just going to hit the sort of the highlights. So it's already protected by the Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act, and all of the best science doesn't show any evidence of a population decline. And there's 5 key studies that really underpin this issue, one of which has not been released, and that's an update to these density models. You can keep going forward. And that study, meanwhile, we're being asked to comment on studies and information that is not available to us and will not be available to us until the comment period expires. But prior to, so earlier in this year, in 2023, BOEM came out and acknowledged in the final supplemental EIS that there was new information, but nothing would require changes to the supplemental EIS. And NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, said the same thing. So the current habitat is sufficient and does not require expansion. So fast forward, these groups sue the government immediately settles with them, entered into a stipulated stay agreement that only applies to the offshore oil and gas industry. So it included an NTL, BOEM, which was not a party to the litigation, has issued a notice to lessees that outlines a voluntary process for during the reinitiated consultation with NMFS on the critical habitat designation. But all of the stipulations, including the fact that you're limited to 10 knots an hour, you can't traverse at night, and one of the busiest international shipping lanes in the world, are now included in lease sale stipulations for both lease sale 261 later this month and for all future lease sales. So this is not going to just be limited, the impacts are not going to be limited to just the offshore oil and gas industry. It's going to include adverse impacts affecting every ocean stakeholder. But the key here is, instead of going through the ESA process, they basically agreed to everything that the ENGOs who sued the government wanted. And all of this is happening through interagency consultation, and it deprives all of us a meaningful opportunity to comment and a direct violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Now recognize Mr. Andre Monet, who's a partner at Best and Krieger. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee. Really a privilege and honor to be here today. As noted, I'm a partner with a law firm here based in Washington, D.C. I have the great privilege of working with farmers and water utilities and state agencies on water supply and water quality issues across the western U.S. I'm really pleased that the forum has been convened to look at the ESA. As noted, there are some really positive things about the Endangered Species Act. Saving the bald eagle, probably the most notable. But there also continue to be challenges that the regulated community faces with implementing the Act. So the comments I have and the recommendations I have are consistent, I think, with what you've already heard from the folks on this panel. There's a need for finality in permitting decisions and for folks that are invested in the ESA to know what they're doing is going to be a final action. There's a need for expedition of permitting and other processes so that time constraints related to project development can be limited. And most importantly, there's a need for cooperative action in terms of implementing the Endangered Species Act. That is really one of the major flaws with the Act. The legislation itself is written in terms of individual action versus individual species. When we know, in hindsight, that preserving land and habitat for species to live in is actually probably more important than a prohibition on taking the species itself. And the ESA, frankly, doesn't do it, right? So United States Fish and Wildlife Service has developed processes, such as the Habitat Conservation Plan program, to encourage landowners to develop and work and create conservation areas. But that process has been fraught and not always deployed evenly. And I can give you an example. In 2000, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the Santa Ana sucker as an endangered species. And in 2005, designated critical habitat up and down the Santa Ana River watershed for the fish. Now, the Santa Ana River is a typical coastal stream in Southern California. It starts in the mountains east of Los Angeles, flows through the Inland Empire, and out through Orange County. What's notable about that river is it's the water supply source for millions of people, and there have been water rights settlements on that river going back 60 years or so. Those rights processes are in place and working out well. So the water agencies and water purveyors on that river, when the critical habitat designation occurred, got together with Fish and Wildlife, developed a habitat conservation plan, and came to an agreement about preserving certain lands and continuing operations on others. And Fish and Wildlife entered into an implementation agreement about that plan and agreed not to designate any additional critical habitat within the plan area as long as the plan was being implemented. 5 years later, Fish and Wildlife changed its mind and designated critical habitat within the plan area, even though the plan was being implemented. Now, the water agencies were clearly upset. They objected to it and went to court. The case ended up before the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit, unfortunately for the water agencies, sided with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So what message did that end up sending? There's a lot going on with that case that I'm happy to talk about, because it provides good examples of problems with how the HCP program can be implemented and critical habitat designations can be implemented. But the fundamental issue is when you try and work with Fish and Wildlife, they may not be a reliable partner, and you're going to invest time and resources into that effort, and they may change their mind. And that's not a good place to end up. In order to really be effective with conservation programs and protecting species, you need to have cooperation and you need to have reliable partnerships, and that undercut that completely. So that also goes to the issue of time. It takes a lot of time to put into those programs, and that hinders the eventual development and implementation of projects. And for public projects, that matters. That's the time that it takes to get a hospital built, or a school built, or a transportation project built, or a water supply project built. And sometimes these delays are a decade in the making because it takes time for permitting, environmental review, biological opinions, et cetera. Those are things that we really need to focus on going forward. And the potential reforms, I think, that we can see through the Endangered Species Act, and I'll list out a few because I'm just about out of time, but these are small steps, but they could be effective and provide relief in the short term. Single agency regulation. We've got NOAA and NIMS, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife both regulating in the same space. And that creates contradictions sometimes and makes it hard for the regulated community. Meaningful permitting reform that expedites timelines and provides finality so that when someone gets a permit or gets an approval, they know they're done. We don't have U.S. Fish and Wildlife changing their mind and forcing additional changes, or worse, using other processes such as state law to try and get additional concessions out of a project development. We need to empower federal wildlife agencies to encourage that kind of cooperative approach, most importantly using voluntary participation. That's not easy. It does cost money. It takes more carrots than sticks, but I think it's really the only effective way to move forward with the Endangered Species Act. And lastly, the federal government needs to manage its own resources. There's acres, millions of acres of federal land across the West that are not being maintained, and they're posing a risk to habitat and the environment and human life that are much greater than anything anyone could do under the Endangered Species Act. And that risk, most pointedly, is wildfire. If a wildfire comes through Forest Service lands, it spreads on to other private lands, it wipes out all endangered species, all of their habitat, and it takes lives. And the federal government has a lot to do with that, and they need to maintain their own assets and own property. So I'm a little bit over. Thank you for the extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Monet. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony. Appreciate that. And now I will recognize members for 5 minutes for their own questions. First recognize myself. I'd like to start with Commissioner McKinney. Could you discuss and express for us some of the concerns, worries and fears that perhaps you've been hearing from people back home about the introduction of grizzly bears into the North Cascades, or maybe some that you hold yourself?
Well, it just so happens that even though in Yakima County, we're a bit southern of where typically this has been a concern for our residents, even our own Farm Bureau just 2 days ago sent me a concerning letter saying that this is something that they are fearful of. When we talk about contradiction and measuring, of course, where they're looking to actually put them, there's great concern for safety, for livestock, for humans. Also, up in these mountains, we have beautiful orchards that grow, and we have farm workers who are out there, and there's concern for safety. It also violates state law. And I think to speak to the contradiction where people don't really understand why, and I love the quote from President Biden, they just keep trying and trying and trying. And folks don't have enough time to follow every state and federal agency that is continuing to find a new way to violate their rights and confuse them. I spoke just briefly to the integrated plan, but one of our issues that we're trying to do is promote fish supplies. we would actually be served with notices of violation if we don't actually get those fish supplies where we need them, and certainly introducing bears isn't going to help when we're trying to get these salmon smolts up into creeks and streams where they haven't been for decades. So right now the concern is it's safety, but more than anything, it's just frustration that everything seems to happen with huge momentum in courtrooms, and the average farmer or citizen doesn't know how they can continue to offer comments to the contrary to the federal government and make a difference.
Ms. McKinney, have you heard any news out of the Department of Interior as far as the process, any updates from them recently?
Not from them. I would say as a county commissioner, I don't receive a lot of news from them, but it's interesting because it just speaks to how concerned citizens are. I heard about it from a concerned citizen. And I actually heard about it from a concerned citizen who wasn't even in my county, but because I do have the privilege of serving on the State Association of Counties and on the NACO Western Interstate Region Board, they happened to know that I was very involved in agriculture issues. And they reached out to me saying, they're trying to reintroduce bears again. Isn't this against state law? What can we do about this? And that caused me to speak to our congressional representatives, speak to our legislative steering committee. We have a state law that prohibits it, and yet at times the federal government doesn't seem to care about states' rights. So I think that really ultimately it is just the constant confusion that people don't know where to turn. And there is no collaboration with county commissioners, with the local municipalities. We're not getting information from the Department of Interior, and certainly they might be communicating with the state, but they may be communicating with certain folks within our state of Washington who might be eager to have that reintroduction, not listening to the residents and the constituents who actually reside where it would be.
Thank you. Mr. Hamilton, you've sounded like you had experience with the grizzly in Wyoming. Could you talk about the experiences that you and your people you represent have had, and how that may be a message that you could send to people in Washington State?
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Grizzly bears are a challenge for our agricultural producers. In the western part of the state, where they've been in existence for a number of years, those livestock producers over there have had to implement quite a few things to try and raise livestock in there. For instance, one of our members who has sheep, they were required by the Forest Service to put their sheep into an electric fence every night to protect them from the grizzly bear. That only worked until the grizzly bear managed to get through the fence, and then they had a refrigerator there. One of our members who lives in an irrigated area was out checking the irrigation one morning, and she noticed grizzly bear tracks coming through her cornfield. Young lady that's probably 110 pounds soaking wet, her best weapon at that time would have been a shovel. That's not going to cut it with a grizzly bear. These are animals that are coming into areas that they've never been in Wyoming. And yet, and I think the experience that was mentioned earlier, delisting the grizzly bear has been almost impossible. We've got a number of things that have happened that have really made this thing problematic as far as allowing our folks to have some certainty about what's going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, my time's expired, so we'll turn now to Mr. Bentz from the great state of Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for holding this hearing. Mr. Monet, I'm interested in knowing how you might suggest we better measure the impact of the Endangered Species Act when it's brought into play through regulation or otherwise. And as kind of a foundation for the discussion, I would draw your attention to the mitigation approach that's being used in different places. In my state of Oregon, for example, if you want a permit, then the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has a tool available called mitigation. They want you first to avoid damage and then to try to minimize damage. And then finally, to get your permit, they will say, well, you have to mitigate against it. And to do that, they measure the amount of environmental impact that whatever activity you're planning on doing is going to have. And then they gin up an amount of mitigation that you must generate. And that's being done in different ways. I don't need to go into detail, but the point here is that on the environmental side of things, when there is an impact by some activity, there is a structure in place that tries, I guess, I think very inartfully, to make whole the environment, offsetting, if you will, whatever our activity might have been. My question to you is, have you seen anything on the other side of the equation? For example, I'd like to use the Deschutes River and the North Unit as an example. The spotted frog was discovered, and now the local farmer ranching and the various small town communities is going to have to spend $350 million to pipe their entire system. But that's not deemed mitigation. In fact, that's not even viewed as something that requires much attention, other than the community needs to get busy and figure out how to pay for it. Do you think there should be, in our review of the Endangered Species Act, some means of addressing these collateral impacts? It certainly is happening on the environmental side if we look at the mitigation situation and actually it's across the nation, this mitigation concept. Anyway, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for the question. There's a couple of ways to look at this, and I think one of them, again, it comes back to that collaborative approach between the regulators and the regulated community. In an instance where you have an endangered species that needs help, and the federal government starts looking to the local community to pay for that, that becomes pretty untenable pretty quickly. Like, small communities don't have $350 million to go pay for a new water system. Farmers don't have $350 million to take off the top line to go build new water systems. So the federal government is going to need to step in there in one way or another and provide some of that funding. And I think that's where the collaborative approach can come in. There can be assistance in grants to cities so they can help reline their system or build water systems as necessary. There can be fallowing programs developed with farmers that are rotating, so you don't kill the community. Maybe you change crops. Maybe you let some fields, or reduce the water usage in the case of the frog, but don't kill the enterprise so that the community can still thrive. But you need the flexibility to do that, and I think that the Endangered Species Act and the regulations that have been promulgated are hemming people in, especially our regulators in the fish and wildlife community, and they don't often look outside that box and don't feel like they can engage in that. Or worse, like the example I gave, they'll engage in that for a long time and then in the last minute decide they don't want to or can't and then back out. So I think there are all structural changes, and I think that's the empowerment issue I mentioned of getting fish and wildlife to know that they have that ability, but also that there's a federal role there as well. And you might also look to the Clean Water Act. When it was initially passed, there was a lot of money given to sewage treatment systems across the country to get from primary to secondary treatment. That kind of model could work as well in these scenarios. Again, the federal government wants to see this species survive. They're going to impose these restrictions on local communities, farmers, et cetera. They need to help bear that burden. They can't just place that on others. And that's how I'd start to frame it.
Well, thank you for that. I just noticed in hearings we had previously on the right whale, the amazing disconnect between the measure of the damage done to the local community by what we kind of saw in Mr. Bruce's presentation. When it comes to the benefit trying to be achieved, that is saving one whale or two, and the astounding damage being done to the community on the other hand, it seems to me that needs to be at the very least highlighted as we try to address these challenges. But thank you all for being here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bentz. Now turn to Mr. Carl from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not have a prepared speech, but I've got a couple of questions, and I've also got some statements to make here. I think the environmental community had great intent when it started out, because I am a product of the 60s and 70s also. I can remember when things weren't so well. I can remember the things that we have done and all the improvements. But in this meeting and other meetings, I continuously say, let's focus on our accomplishments and let's quit breaking the backs of our businesses with the new stuff. And it's got totally out of hand. We've got so many of these environmental terrorists, as I call them. They'll come in on our business side. The Rice's well, which I'll get to in just a second, is a great example. That's what they're using that for. Do we care about the well? Of course we care about the well. Do we care about the beach mouse? Everybody wants to talk about the beach mouse in Alabama. Well, let's talk about the beach mouse for just a minute. We have 21-plus miles of beach in South Alabama. Prestige, beautiful, most gorgeous beach you've ever seen in your life. They found a beach mouse there when Ronald Reagan was in office. The only difference between that beach mouse and a field rat, I call them all rats, I'm sorry, where I'm from they're a rat, is a little bit of a color change. They cannot get that beach mouse to live on that beach. And they say, well, it's due to environment, it's due to development. 21 miles of beach, 7+ miles of that is government owned, and you can't even get the beach mouse to exist on that. So we're spending millions of dollars a year doing studies, replanting beach mouses back on this beach. We can grow 20,000 in a laboratory in Auburn, Alabama, in a 12-month period, but we can't keep but 3 alive in 40 years on a beach. Maybe the environment is not designed for that mouse. That is what I'm trying to say in my statements is let's use some common sense. No one on this board wants to take an endangered species and make it extinct. No one does. But at some point, place, and time, we have to use common sense. The rice well. The rice well came up with, I was on a charter boat out in the Gulf. This young man chartering that boat, he's in his 40s. I asked him how many wells he's seen out there in his 40 years of existence, because he is a third generation doing this. He or his father could not tell you ever seeing a well out there. But yet, all of a sudden, we have a new species that's in the Gulf that's going to interrupt our flow of traffic in and out of the Port of Mobile. We ship a lot of consumer goods. These plastic bottles, these cell phones, all these things that you're handling that they can't bring through California anymore because of the environmental decay out there that they've just destroyed that state. They're actually bringing through ports like Mobile, Houston, and New Orleans. And we're glad to have it. We love to have it. But they're going to take the rice well and they're going to shut that down. The terrorists are using that against our own people, and we can't allow it to happen. We need that petroleum out there. We've argued over those leases out there for months on this, and we've gotten nowhere, absolutely nowhere. No one's listening because the environmental community runs this town. If you hadn't figured that out yet, I just gave you the hint. County Commissioner, I came from where you're at, and as County Commissioner, I appreciate what you do. We worked hard. I'm the only one in this room that bought wetlands, and I know y'all don't have this problem out west. I actually bought wetlands to protect it. No one else in this room has done anything like that. I did it because I want to protect it. I did it because I thought it was what I should do as someone that was capable of doing it. So I did it. Those are the type things we need to do. We need to use common sense and take these wetlands and take these protected areas and take our kids to them and teach them to understand it. Teach them to participate in it. I taught my kids you don't kill anything unless you eat it. Nothing. You don't kill it unless you eat it. And that's the way, and let nature take its course. So when you talk about the beach mouse or you talk about the whale, it's become an environmental terrorist group that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with it in this town, we're dealing with it in our states, we're dealing with it in our counties, and that's where I get upset and I get angry about this environmental issues that we're talking about. They're not issues, we're making them issues. Leave Mother Nature alone. We're going to keep changing it until human beings won't be able to live in it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I turn back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Newhouse, and thank you again to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Hamilton, in a hearing not too long ago in the Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee, there's an interesting response to a question that I asked. When one of the witnesses said that one of the problems with the ESA is that it turns species and habitat into a liability instead of an asset for private landowners. In your view, how can we do a better job of making at-risk species an asset to private landowners as opposed to a liability?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's a very good question because I think in my written remarks I talked about the black-footed ferret. And when there was a symposium put out where some ranchers were there and other folks come along, some of the ranchers came up to my predecessor and said, I think I've seen those, but I'll be darned if I'm going to tell anybody in the federal government about it. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have, because we have species out there that most landowners would be happy to have on their ranch or their farm. It's just that the uncertainty that you have when you have an endangered species, the lawsuits that you have, we talked about weaponization of the Endangered Species Act, and that's what's happened in a lot of cases. So I think you have to, if the federal government, in the case of large predators, said, hey, I'm willing to help support you ranchers for the livestock that are killed by these endangered species. That's something the federal government didn't do. It was left up to an environmental organization to do it, and now it's the state of Wyoming. And in fact, Brian Nesvik, the director of the Game and Fish, I think was testifying in Washington here in March. $59 million is what Wyoming has spent trying to get the grizzly bear off the list. So I think we have to have a process on those species that reach recovery to get them off the list. I think we have to have some flexibility so that if a rancher says, I might have a species on my list or on my place, that I'm not afraid to talk to some wildlife folks. You got, in my opinion, to make those game and fish folks in our state more of a partner, because there is a relationship there and there's a trust level that's much higher than the Fish and Wildlife Service.
And you did talk about that in your testimony with the grizzly, and could you elaborate a little bit more on how that would be beneficial to both the species and the landowner if management of the grizzly were turned over to the Wyoming, I'm not sure if you call it Game and Fish or what it is in Wyoming? It's the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, I know that.
Yes, Mr.
They
Chairman.
probably wouldn't want to manage grizzly bears in Wyoming, though, but...
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that number one is that in Wyoming, once we reach that recovery level, that when that species stayed on the list, it pointed out to both the state officials and the citizens that the federal government's not going to turn over control of those. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department is responsible for damages caused by trophy game animals, and the grizzly bear is listed as a trophy game animal. So they recognize that if you get grizzly bears in places where there's a tremendous amount of damage, you can take some action that will mitigate those losses. So I think that's one thing. I think another possible solution is that you would treat those animals as something that could be managed in a more flexible way. Right now, the folks in Idaho are mad at Wyoming, because we've discovered if we relocate grizzly bears on the west slope of the Tetons, they travel down into Idaho and go through their potato fields. I just talked to one of the members over there. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to do. We need to have some flexibility in there. We need to treat the states as partners, and we need to talk to those landowners and say, what do you need to make these things less of an economic burden?
I had a quick question for Mr. Monette regarding habitat. I think the key to all of this is habitat, but having a definition of what constitutes habitat, that seems to be where the rub is. And no longer is it just habitat or critical habitat, it's what could be critical habitat. What do you think the definition should look like? How could this help in making the Endangered Species Act actually work better?
Well, I think it's, again, thank you for the question. It's a very important question. As you're aware, the text of the Endangered Species Act does not define habitat. Instead, it defines critical habitat and the ways that it can be designated. The Supreme Court had a case in 2018 where they came really close to giving a definition of it, but instead remanded it down to the Fifth Circuit, in which the case eventually settled without an answer. In that case, the court held that areas of critical habitat can't be designated unless they are in fact habitat, and then remanded the case to figure out what habitat was. So in 2019, there was a proposed rule and eventually a rule adopted by the Fish and Wildlife defining that term, but that's since been rescinded. So, critically, we need that definition. And, I would define it as where the species is capable of living now without significant habitat modification. And that doesn't seem to be that controversial, but apparently it is, because the the definition has been rescinded to ostensibly, give people more flexibility or for whatever reasons they had for rescinding it. But to me, it seems a simple question and one that we need an answer on. And again, another thing that this committee could consider making a change to in the ESA.
That's something that seems like Congress could fix. If you mentioned it hasn't been fixed in the courts, and it's seems to be all over the place. So I think that's good feedback. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. And now turn to Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes. Jared?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chance to join this conversation. I'm a bit of an outlier. I am the only Democrat in the room. Some might say I'm the only one dumb enough to be here. But Chairman Westerman issued the invitation, and to his credit, he did not rescind it when I accepted it. So here I am. And the truth...
We're happy to have you, too.
I'm glad to see you as well, Mr. Newhouse. Anytime someone wants to have a conversation, an honest conversation about the ESA and trying to make it work better, I want to be in the room. I want to listen, and I appreciate the chance to listen to the perspectives today. My main concern is that we're hearing one set of perspectives and narratives, a narrow one, a perspective that is exclusively critical of the ESA, of the perceived burdens and costs and inconveniences of the ESA. And missing from that conversation are all of the other perspectives. The successes of the ESA, the benefits, broad societal benefits, even economic benefits of the ESA, the many success stories where we have gotten it right under the ESA. And so the danger is when you exclude all those perspectives and listen only to the voices that are calling for weakening the ESA, for delisting species, you create a bit of an echo chamber. And you're not having a full conversation about a really important subject. So I wish that this working group had a chance to hear from folks about those things, about other science-based perspectives on many of the subjects and narratives that have been raised here today. I think you would hear a very different story about the role of predators, including grizzly bears and wolves, and many of the species that have been discussed and almost thinly vilified in some of this conversation. I think you would hear about the science behind many of the things that have been characterized as arbitrary and capricious and unreasonable. The strength of the ESA is it is science-based. And everyone loves the science when it's easy, when it's convenient, but we struggle sometimes when the science tells us we have to do things that for some interests at least are inconvenient. And that's really where some of the politics of this ESA conversation seem to break down. The agenda materials for this gathering, for this proceeding, listed a string of Republican bills that attack the ESA. There's nothing in that agenda, in these materials, that talk about strengthening it, making it work better. It's about delisting wolves and long-eared bat and the sage grouse and the grizzly bear. I read it all. I looked through everything for something that would suggest a way to strengthen and modernize in a good way this really important law. It's not there. It's just things to make it harder to designate critical habitat and harder, if not impossible, to ever list species. If this committee wanted to look at making the ESA work better, if our shared goal is to actually recover species so that we don't have to fight about them being on the endangered species list, there's some great studies that I would commend to you that have looked at listings and success stories, species that have managed to recover and come off that list. They all point to things like earlier listing. They all point to things like more funding for habitat conservation and partnerships and other things that we say we believe in, and yet many of my colleagues that criticize the ESA consistently fight to slash funding for those things. So I've got a couple of studies, Mr. Chairman, that I would love to submit to you. I hope they can become part of the record. And I just want to close, Mr. Monette, if I could, say hello to your partner, Greg Wilkinson. He will remember me. He's a good lawyer. In a prior life, we litigated against each other. But with the Santa Ana sucker, I assume you were referring to a multi-species habitat conservation plan that had been developed prior to the litigation, is that right?
That's correct.
And the Ninth Circuit decision that upheld an additional critical habitat designation that you took issue with, what was the basis of their holding? Because my understanding is, they didn't just want to move the goalpost on all the stakeholders that had done the right thing and signed up for this HCP. There was actually a compelling scientific case that was made that the protected habitat under that plan was inadequate, that they had to add additional protected habitat. Am I wrong about that?
I think it's in the eye of the beholder in some ways. The areas within the Santa Ana River that were excluded for the benefit of that habitat plan were excluded. It had basically the same function as areas that were included in other watersheds. And the Fish and Wildlife Service felt that that was inconsistent, notwithstanding the fact that the HCP plan was designed to provide other kinds of protection for those areas because of the plan. So that was the basis for the reversal at the administrative level. And when it reached the Ninth Circuit held that that was fully within the discretion of the agencies.
Okay. I would love to go deeper into that, but I see that I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman, and you're not an outlier. We're happy to have you here, but just remind you too, and members of the working group, every member before this forum was asked to solicit suggestions for participants as witnesses, and so we have what we have. I don't think anything came from your office, but we'll certainly remind folks to do that for the next forum. With that, Ms. Hageman from Wyoming.
Yes, thank you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the dire need to update the Endangered Species Act. A special thanks to all of the witnesses who traveled to be here with us today. Regarding the ESA, we find ourselves in an awful plight. Legislation crafted half a century ago now prevents us from effectively managing our lands and resources, putting certain species, the environment, and even people in danger. Today, we find ourselves doing what government does best, and that is trying to fix the last solution. And with the ESA being used to destroy businesses and control vast swaths of private land and other natural resources. Wyomingites are all too familiar with the fatal repercussions of the ESA. I echo the sentiment of frustrated ranchers and terrified tourists dealing with wolves and grizzlies in my home state. Repeatedly, we have observed the Fish and Wildlife Service waste massive resources and force states and businesses to do the same by blocking efforts to delist already recovered species. This was the case with our 15-year battle to delist the recovered gray wolf population in the state of Wyoming, and it is an ongoing battle to delist the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear, despite the fact that we met the recovery goals for that population almost a quarter century ago. In Wyoming, cattle ranchers have watched helplessly as their calf deaths have increased, escalating from around 2% in early 1990 to around 10% today because of the failure to delist the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear. The fact is that this rate is unsustainable. The ESA has become a method used by environmentalists to eliminate commercial uses of federal lands that are essential to the economic well-being of states and local communities. On top of that, the financial burdens that come with heavy federal regulations are pushed onto private ranchers and state agencies. As you just indicated, Mr. Hamilton, the state of Wyoming has spent $59 million recovering the grizzly bear to the population where it is today. And as one of my other constituents put it, the ESA is too top-down with virtually no support for the affected states and landowners. Mr. Hamilton, you explain in your testimony how the federal government has forced landowners and states to bear the costs of the ESA. And it's also worth mentioning that even after species are fully recovered, endless litigation prevents states and landowners from ever shaking off the burden of the costs associated with these impacts. Mr. Hamilton, what are the biggest barriers to getting species delisted after the recovery goals are met?
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman, I think there's a number of them, depending on whether that species is a charismatic megafauna, like the grizzly bears or the wolves, where there's a group out there that says, I'm going to litigate this every chance I get. And we talked earlier about the science. The science for wolf delisting was adamant that we'd reach that recovery goal 10 or 15 years before we managed to get them off the list. In fact, it took an act of Congress to get them off the list in Idaho and Montana. That, I think, just really points out the problem with the Endangered Species Act. If you're talking about something like sage grouse, most ranchers I know of are very happy about having sage grouse on their land. If you had some mechanism that would incentivize those folks, I think you would see a lot more cooperation. You can't have a system that penalizes the agricultural producer, the landowner, and gives them a huge economic burden and then turn around and say, but we want you to help us by letting your private land be part of their habitat. So I just think that we need to have some mechanism to look at what we can do to legitimately allow legal representation when it's needed, but at the same time stop the weaponization of that, because once you get a private or a endangered species on your land, it opens up the litigation gates. It creates so much uncertainty that no landowner in their right mind is going to agree to have, even let anybody know an endangered species might be on their land.
Well, then, Mr. Monette, as an attorney, wouldn't you agree that the Endangered Species Act has become big, big business for certain environmental groups and the lawyers that represent them?
I was thinking to myself, thank you for the question. That is one of the successes, I suppose, of the Endangered Species Act is the industry it has spawned, unfortunately, I guess. That there is the sue and settle approach that was mentioned by my colleague on the panel here, Mr. Bruce, that allows people to get paid essentially for filing lawsuits, and it is unfortunate.
Well, and thank you. I wish I had an opportunity to question each of you and engage with each of you about your personal experiences. Again, we very much appreciate your willingness to travel here and engage in this discussion, because it's extremely important that we get this right this time and that we actually work to protect and recover species rather than protecting the attorneys that protect environmental groups that are related to the Endangered Species Act. So thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Higgeman. All right, very good. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony this morning, and as well as the members for your perspectives and your questions. Your folks' voices are the voices we need to hear, so thank you for that. I believe it's been demonstrated that there truly is a clear need for reform of the ESA, not throwing it out, but to improve it, because our goal should be to make species as strong as possible. And I think that was echoed in the testimonies of the panelists today. So we as a working group, we're going to take what we heard today from all perspectives, and our goal is to craft legislation, meaningful legislation, that will overhaul and return the ESA to its original intent, and that is recovering species. So with that, I'll adjourn the forum. Thank you very much for being here.
By the way, the Center of Biological Diversity, they're based in Tucson.
Oh, really?
Thank you, Harriet.
And I've had discussions with him and one of their attorneys, and I'm not an attorney. And he was fairly blunt. He said, our job is to sue. That is our primary goal.
It just needs to make sense to the person who owns the land. I just look around and think, you know what? How many species were obliterated making this capital? Downtown New York, downtown Seattle, and the only places that are having to bear this burden are
the West.
places that are rural
Predominant,
and western, because we actually still have natural habitat where you notice these things. But I'm sorry, it has to make sense. At what point do you say, okay, $350 million for a frog? The community who lives there, they get to decide. You know what? We don't have $350 million. Sometimes that frog, Mother Nature, and you know what? That frog possibly could adapt. And maybe some of the species we're living with today adapted to their environment previously. Did that happen?
That's right.
Around the mines, animals.
Excuse me.
very readily adapt because they know they're in a friendly and safe environment.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so
And I am
much.
very sorry I didn't have time to engage with
Just
you.
make it make sense to the people who pay for it.
That's right, that's right. We appreciate you. We appreciate what you do. We appreciate you. The fact that you make our life better.
Oh, I know. I was a little, he was pretty tame. I think we didn't get him like easy.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll see you tonight. Thank you again for participating.
Nice meeting you. I just told Ryan.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, totally understand. Okay.